Some weeks ago, when the Sunday readings were centered around the theme of humility, I mentioned in my homily that we really don't begin to understand and appropriate humility until we begin to realize that what gives meaning to our lives is not what we think or what we feel or what we want, nor is it what others think or feel or want. I mentioned that what really gives meaning to our lives is when we begin to tap into what God thinks, what he feels, and what he wants. And when we can begin to not only become aware of that, but when we begin to embrace and to try to appropriate that, then we truly begin to grow in humility and a ton of other virtues. And this is at the core, again, of this Sunday's readings. This is exactly what Solomon in that first reading was praying for. He was praying for wisdom, right? And God validates him and says, you've prayed for the most important, you've asked for the most important thing anyone can ask for. And what is wisdom other than the ability to see reality as God sees it, and to desire reality to unfold as God desires it to unfold. I mentioned, some weeks ago when I was talking about this, that when we begin to do that, all of a sudden we really begin to experience a greater sense of freedom and peace within ourselves. Because so often, when we become so preoccupied with what we think and what we feel and what we want and with what other people think and feel and want, it puts so much pressure on us. It causes so much needless anxiety. It makes us go through life heavier. So you kind of go through life as if you're dragging a ball and chain around. And that's not what God wants for us. God wants us to go through life freely, as lightly, as joyfully, as peacefully as we can. God wants to free us of that burden. And obviously, if we try to look at life and we try to desire to live out life the way that God does, well, it's still going to bring a lot of hardship, because we're not going to get rid of hardship until we go upstairs, but it'll be a lot easier than if we try to go or to live against the grain. And that only makes sense because at the end of the day, God knows and understands life far better than we do. I like to say often, God knows life. All of us, we're guessing our way through it. God knows life because he designed it. Now, clearly, the mishaps, the tragedies, the sufferings that take place in life, they don't necessarily come from God's hands. Those are the consequences of human sin. But God has a remedy for all that dysfunction. God will bring life out of anything, and I mean anything, even death. That's at the core of what we believe in. So the goal as followers of Christ is to all the more try to see what God sees, feel what he feels, and want what he wants. And that's what Jesus is referring to in those parables. In the treasure, right? The lost treasure, that when one finds it, you just chuck everything else away because nothing else matters. Nothing else is that important. That's what he refers to when he talks about the fine pearl. That when you find it, you want it, and nothing else has that much value. That's the real prize. And this is what is at the center of God's kingdom, is this ability to see life, to feel life, to desire life as God does. Now, let's go back to our thoughts and feelings and those of others. It's not totally useless either. Our feelings, our thoughts, our feelings, our desires, and those of others do have some value, but their value is contingent upon how much they are in sync with God's. So how do we know? How do we know if we are seeing things like God, if we're feeling things like God, if we're desiring things like God does? Well, I'll give you a couple of pointers. One of them, how God sees reality. God has already revealed that. He started revealing it throughout the Old Testament. He gave it full expression in the person of Jesus, and everything that God taught us through Jesus, Jesus handed down to the apostles and asked them to keep handing that down to future generations. In other words, it's what is there in the teachings of the church. God reveals how he sees reality. God reveals what he desires in the teachings of the church. You know, if we are disaligned from those teachings in some shape, way, or form, well, you know, guess what? We're going to be conflicted. We're going to be conflicted because we're going to try to live life as it has not been designed to be lived. And God is not schizophrenic. God doesn't change his mind here or there. And, the teachings of the church tries to give expression to those teachings in an appropriate way with the changing times. But the truth, what's at the kernel of those teachings, does not change. Because if not, God would be a nut. And he's not. The nuts are down here. Another way that we can gauge if we are aligned with what God thinks or what he feels or what he wants is simply to look at the realities, the responsibilities that have been entrusted to us. And we're called to live within those responsibilities and within the boundaries of those responsibilities. Let me give you a couple examples that may be helpful. If you're a married person, you should try to live like a married person. You cannot live like a single person. That's going to create problems. That's going to create tons of conflict. If you have a spouse, if you have children, well, guess what? Every now and then, of course, to keep your sanity, you may need a night out or a day out with the boys or with the gals, but you better be present to your spouse. You better be present to your kids. If not, there's going to be trouble, understandably, because you're out of sync with the reality that's been entrusted to you. If you are, even at work, right? If your staff, right, in any shape, way, or form, it's very simple. Don't try to be the supervisor. That's not what you're being called to do. Boy, oh boy, does it often happen, right? If you're the supervisor, don't try to be the CEO. And if you're the CEO, don't be so foolish to think you're God, because watch what'll happen real quick. if you try to be God. If you're a priest, right? Don't try to be the archbishop. Why would anybody in their right mind want to do that? Yet sometimes it happens with some guys, right? If you're a priest and you're in the parish and you're not the pastor, you're the parochial vicar, don't try to be the pastor. By the way, that's not a problem we have at all, at all. Father Irenaeus, listen, I hope they keep him here for 6,000 years. You know, he's wise enough. He's wise enough to not want that burden, and so on and so forth. You kind of get the point. What God wants for us is not out there in some cosmic wave that we have to, figure out through extraordinary means. No. What God wants for us is right in front of us. Is right in front of us. May the Lord help us to all the more grow in wisdom, to all the more discover what His kingdom is really all about. May help us more clearly see what He sees, feel what He feels, desire what He desires, so that we can all the more live really in the freedom, the joy, the peace of that kingdom which He hands to us as a great treasure, as a very, very fine pearl. My dear friends, let us now stand.